Money, power, status. In the modern world, we often think of these three things as inseparable. If you have enough money, you usually have the power to shape the world around you. But for most of Chinese history, that wasn't the case at all. For over 2,000 years, Chinese society was governed by a strict social hierarchy known as 士农工商. At the top were the scholars, 士, the brilliant minds who ran the government. Next were the farmers, 农, the backbone of the empire who fed everyone. Then came the artisans, 工, the skilled creators who built everything. And at the very bottom, the merchants, 商. From our modern perspective, the line between artisan and merchant might seem a little blurry. But in ancient China, the line was drawn at one thing: production. An artisan was anyone who used their hands and skills to create something. From a blacksmith forging a blade to a weaver turning raw thread into silk. In fact, most urban commoners fell into this category. Even a chef running a small noodle stall counted as an artisan, because they were transforming raw ingredients into a meal. Since they added value through their own labor, they were respected as productive members of society. A merchant, however, was someone who simply transported goods from where they were abundant to where they were scarce. They didn't grow the tea, they didn't cook the food, they just bought it cheap in one city and sold it expensive in another. To the Confucian scholar, this wasn't commerce, it was exploitation. A neighborhood shopkeeper who made things with their hands could still be seen as a respectable craftsman. But the wealthy tycoon moving thousands of crates of tea across the empire? He was viewed as a social parasite, living off the price difference created by other people's hard work. Now here's the thing. This hierarchy wasn't always a rigid, unchanging law. Depending on the era or the emperor, the specific rules shifted. But the stigma, that was constant. Even if a merchant was wealthier than a prince, they were often legally and socially treated as unproductive middlemen. In various periods, they were forbidden from wearing fine silk, riding horses, or even putting their children's name forward for the imperial exams. To the ruling class, the merchant was a necessary evil, someone who moved goods but created no real value. The history is rarely as simple as a list of rules. Beneath the surface of the rigid system, the merchant class was constantly fighting, innovating, and quietly reshaping the destiny of the empire. Hi everyone, I'm Amy. Today we're going to explore the evolution of the merchants. We'll travel through time to see how these social outcasts used their wit, their wealth, and their stories to climb the ladder of the 士农工商 system, and how they eventually changed China forever. To understand the merchant, we first have to understand the world that tried to suppress them. During the Warring States period, China was a patchwork of rival kingdoms locked in a brutal 250-year struggle for survival. In this era of constant warfare, the ideal citizen was the farmer, because farmers grew the grain that fed the army and raised the sons who fought on the front lines. The influential philosopher Xunzi argued that if there were too many merchants, the state would fall into poverty, because productive work would be abandoned. This thinking led the kingdom of Qin to adopt a policy that was prioritize agriculture, restrain commerce. It is deeply iconic then that the man who helped pave the way for the unification of China was not a soldier or a scholar, but a merchant. His name was Lü Buwei. According to the records of the grand historian, Lü Buwei was a great merchant of Yangdi who had built his family fortune by buying low and selling high. He was the living personification of the merchant class, mobile, wealthy, and opportunistic. Around 260 BCE, while doing business in the kingdom of Zhao, he encountered a minor Qing prince named Yi Ren. Yi Ren was a discarded son living in poverty as a political hostage, completely forgotten by his father back home. While everyone else saw a pathetic prisoner, the merchant Lü Buwei saw an undervalued asset. According to the strategies of the Warring States, Lü Buwei went home and had a very revealing conversation with his father about return on investment. Lü Buwei asked, "What is the profit from tilling the land?" To which his father replied, "Tenfold." Then Lü Buwei asked, "And from trading pearls and jade?" His father replied, 100-fold. And finally, Lü Buwei asked, "And from establishing a ruler for a state?" His father paused, then said, "Beyond measure." In the end, Lü Buwei famously concluded, "This is a rare commodity that should be hoarded." And so, he began his hoarding. He gave Yi Ren 500 gold pieces to build a reputation and spent another 500 bribing his way into the Qing court, specifically to win over the powerful Lady Huayang, convincing her to adopt Yi Ren as her heir. The investment paid off spectacularly. Yi Ren eventually became the king of Qing, and Lü Buwei was appointed chancellor, the highest position in the scholar hierarchy. A merchant had bypassed the entire social order in a single generation. When Yi Ren died, his son Ying Zhen, the future Qin Shi Huang, ascended the throne as a young boy. Lü Buwei, the merchant from Yangdi, was now effectively running the most powerful kingdom in China. He even tried to change the reputation of the merchant class during this time. He commissioned the Annals of Lü Buwei, a massive encyclopedia of knowledge, as if to say, a man of merchant origins could hold the wisdom of the world. But the social hierarchy had a way of fighting back. As Ying Zhen grew older and more powerful, he became unhappy with Lü Buwei's influence, and scandalous court rumors made things worse. In 235 BCE, Ying Zhen stripped Lü Buwei of his titles and exiled him. Fearing execution, Lü Buwei drank poison and died. The fall of Lü Buwei sent a message that would echo for centuries. You may have the gold, but you will never have the dignity. Ying Zhen went on to unify China under a brutal legalist system, and he saw independent, wealthy merchants as a direct threat to his absolute control. Under the Qing legal code, merchants were registered and classified separately from respectable citizens. They were closely grouped with convicts and the dishonored, and were the first people drafted for brutal forced labor or sent to the most dangerous military frontiers. The Han Dynasty that followed created a more complicated relationship with the merchant class. The founder, Emperor Gaozu, famously prohibited merchants from wearing silk or riding in carriages. And yet, this was the dynasty that sent merchants out on the Silk Road, turning them into international players. As the Han Dynasty armies expanded westward, merchants followed. They weren't just trading silk, they were carrying ideas, religions, and technologies across continents. But the empire always wanted its cut, and the empire always needed more. Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty found himself in a bind. His wars against Xiongnu nomads were bankrupting the empire. Rather than simply taxing the merchants, he decided to become the biggest merchant himself. In 117 BCE, he established state monopolies on salt and iron, the two most profitable industries in the ancient world. This sparked a famous debate, recorded in the discourses on salt and iron. Critics argued that the government shouldn't compete with the people for profit. Defenders argued that the empire had no choice. That argument, should the state control commerce or should the merchant, would define the next 2,000 years of Chinese history. After the Han Dynasty fell, China fractured for nearly 400 years. During this chaos, governments lost the ability to manage large state monopolies and production systems. The state monopolies collapsed, and salt temporarily became more of a free market, where private merchants stepped in to fill the void, because people still needed salt to survive. When the Tang Dynasty eventually reunified China, the imperial government moved to restore control over the salt trade. But the merchants who had spent 4 centuries filling that void weren't going anywhere. The cosmopolitan capital, Chang'an, was now a gigantic metropolis of over 1 million people. with streets full of merchants, monks, and artists from Persia, India, and Central Asia. The merchant class was necessary, but they were still social outcasts, and the government intended to keep it that way. All trade was forced to happen within two massive walled enclosures, the East Market and the West Market, under the watchful eyes of officials, and only during specific daylight hours. If you wanted to buy or sell anything, you did it there, on the government's terms, on the government's schedule. But the merchants had a problem that no wall could solve. Money was heavy. The primary currency of the Tang Dynasty was the copper coin. These coins had a square hole in the middle so that they could be strung together. A string of coins usually held 1,000 coins. For everyday purchases, this was fine. But for a merchant trying to transport a large shipment of silk from the south to the markets of the north, they would need tens of thousands of strings. Entire caravans of wagons were needed just to carry the money, which made them irresistible targets for bandits. For now, they lived with it. But that was about to change. In 755 CE, a catastrophic civil war known as the Anlushan Rebellion tore the dynasty apart. The Tang Dynasty government was desperate for revenue to fight the rebellion. Salt has always been regulated by the empire, but the collapse of the tax system forced the government to expand and reorganize its control over the salt trade. Instead of running the entire operation themselves, they created an indirect monopoly that relied on merchants to distribute the salt for them. Private citizens would produce the salt, but it must be sold to the government at a low fixed price. Then, instead of selling it themselves, the government sold that salt to merchants at a much higher price. And finally, the merchants would then transport and sell the salt to the public at an even higher price to make their own profit. In one move, the Tang Dynasty government had turned the merchant class into the financial lifeline of the empire. The unproductive middlemen were now keeping the lights on. And now that the merchants were suddenly moving enormous amounts of wealth across the country, that old problem of heavy copper became completely unworkable. So they invented a solution. Working with the government's regional offices, they developed the Fei Qian, or flying cash. According to the new book of Tang, the merchants were traveling to the capital with heavy loads of coins, and they began to deposit them with the government's regional offices. This allowed them to travel to the four corners of the empire lightly packed. In exchange, they received a document that allowed them to withdraw the equivalent amount in other regions. This was called flying cash. This was not just a clever workaround. This was the birth of abstract wealth. The idea that money didn't have to be a physical object. It could be a promise written on paper. This was the direct ancestor of paper money. But social status did not move as fast as flying cash. The scholar class still looked down on these new millionaires. The Tang Dynasty sumptuary laws were extremely specific. According to the old book of Tang, merchants were only permitted to wear white or black clothing made of felt or hemp. Colorful silks, forbidden. Ornate weapons, forbidden. But here's where the story gets interesting. By the late Tang Dynasty, the records suggest that the rich merchants had simply stopped caring. They were so wealthy that they began quietly living like the nobility. The high walls of their private estates became filled with forbidden luxuries. The law said one thing, the reality said another. The famous Tang Dynasty poet Bai Juyi captured the merchant's world perfectly in his poem, The Song of the Pipa Player. He writes about a talented female musician who married a tea merchant, who laments, "The merchant thinks of nothing but profit. He left me a month ago to go to Fuliang to buy tea." That one line summarizes the scholar class's view of the merchant. Heartless, driven only by money, and lacking the humanity of the scholar or the honesty of the farmer. By the end of the Tang Dynasty, the merchant was in a strange position. They were the secret bank of the government. They had invented a banking system that the empire itself would eventually have to adopt. They were living in luxury behind closed doors. And yet, in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of the poets, they were still the bottom of the barrel. Everything would change, however, when the walls of the market districts literally came crumbling down. Historians often refer to the Song dynasty as the beginning of China's Great Commercial Revolution. In the previous dynasties, all trade was confined to government-controlled markets, with gates and drums and curfews. But in the Song dynasty capital of Kaifeng, and later Hangzhou, the old market system was abolished. Shops could open anywhere at any time. The beatings of the market drums was replaced by the sounds of a 24-hour city. According to the records of the splendor of the eastern capital, an eyewitness account of life in Kaifeng, the markets were bustling and the sounds of trade did not stop until the third watch of the night, only to begin again at the fifth watch. Even in the dead of winter or during heavy rain, the markets never closed. In this new urban world, the ancient line between the artisan and the merchant began to blur. Historically, someone who ran a restaurant or a tea house was considered an artisan because they produced the meals. But in the Song dynasty, these small-scale producers evolved. They started focusing on branding, luxury service, and sourcing exotic ingredients from hundreds of miles away. They were still technically makers, but they were thinking like merchants. This is the world captured in the Qi drama, A Dream of Splendor. While the drama is fictional, it reflects a real historical truth. Song dynasty entrepreneurs were transforming from simple makers into savvy managers. The skill of the artisan and the vision of the merchant were becoming one and the same. But the most important evolution of the Song dynasty merchant wasn't about lifestyle. It was about paper. Building on the flying cash system of the Tang dynasty, merchants began issuing private paper receipts for deposited coins. About 60 merchant houses managed this system. They realized something profound. As long as people trusted the name of the merchant house, the paper itself held value. This became the world's first paper money, the jiaozi. The history of Song records, initially, the merchants of Sichuan created the jiaozi because the iron coins were too heavy to carry. It was a private arrangement based on trust. Eventually, the Song government saw the power of the system and took it over, turning a merchant's invention into the empire's most powerful economic tool. However, and this is a pattern we'll unfortunately see again and again, when the scholars took over the merchant's innovation, they managed it poorly. The government printed too much money to fund its wars, causing the world's first documented case of paper currency inflation. The merchants had invented the future of finance, but the scholars had yet to learn how to handle it responsibly. But paper money wasn't the only financial instrument the merchants were mastering. They were also revolutionizing the way the empire managed its most lucrative resource, salt. Building on the indirect monopoly model of the Tang dynasty, the Song dynasty government turned the salt trade into something resembling a modern stock market by issuing salt vouchers. Merchants would pay the government cash upfront for the salt voucher. This immediately gave the government the cash that it needed. The merchant would then use their salt voucher to redeem it for the actual salt. However, it could take months to travel to the salt mines to collect the salt and bring it back, during which time the actual value of the salt could have fluctuated. So many clever merchants realized that instead of traveling to collect the salt themselves, they could just sell their salt vouchers. For example, a merchant could buy a voucher for 800 coins when the government was desperate for cash. And then, 2 months later, if the price of salt rose, he could sell that same piece of paper to another merchant for 1,200 coins. In this example, the merchant never touched a bag of salt. He never hired a wagon. He made a 400-coin profit just by trading the promise of salt. Merchants weren't just movers of goods anymore. They were traders of risk. But financial sophistication didn't buy social respect. So the Song Dynasty merchants developed a new strategy, the Scholar-Merchant Alliance. The Song Dynasty relied heavily on the imperial examination system to select government officials. Merchants began pouring their profits into the best tutors for their sons. The logic was simple. I might be a merchant today, but my money can make my son a scholar tomorrow. This created a new social fluidity. The ladder wasn't broken yet, but merchants had started figuring out how to jump up the steps. One interesting example is the great scholar official Su Dongpo. While he was firmly in the scholar class, he was also a legendary food lover and an early pioneer of what we might call brand marketing. He famously lent his name to dishes like Dongpo Rou. Merchants used his fame to sell products, and in turn, the scholars began to appreciate the sophistication of the merchant world, the fine teas, the exquisite silks, and the lively restaurants. By the end of the Song Dynasty, the merchant class had become the engine of the urban economy. And then the Mongols arrived and threw the entire hierarchy into chaos. When the Mongols conquered China and established the Yuan Dynasty, the Shi Nong Gongshang system was flipped on its head. The Mongols were nomads. They didn't especially value the scholar or revere the farmer. What they valued was the merchant. Under Mongol rule, the Han Chinese scholars lost their privileged political position. Meanwhile, merchants, especially the foreign traders from Central Asia and the Middle East, were elevated near the top. Merchants formed trading associations to pull capital and fund long-distance caravans. For nearly a century, the social stigma of being a merchant largely disappeared, because the government itself was essentially a commercial enterprise. The merchant had tasted real power. And when the Ming Dynasty took over, the merchants were not going to let go of their influence easily. By the Ming Dynasty, the merchant class had developed a new and surprisingly sophisticated strategy for survival. It wasn't about fighting the system, it was about becoming the system. This was the era of the great merchant syndicates, and the most powerful of them all came from an unlikely place known as Huizhou, which was the heart of the mountainous region of Anhui. These were the Huizhou merchants, who I briefly talked about in my video about the 8 great cuisines. The Huizhou area was beautiful, but nearly impossible to farm. There was a local saying, 7 parts mountain, 1 part water, and 2 parts farmland. Because the land couldn't support the population, the men of Huizhou had no choice but to leave home and find another way to survive. What made these men different from the traders of risk in the Song Dynasty was how they mastered the salt trade to solve a massive military crisis. In the Ming Dynasty, the empire needed to feed hundreds of thousands of soldiers stationed along the northern borders to defend against the Mongols. But the government was cash poor and couldn't afford the staggering cost of hauling grain across the desert. To solve this, they created the Kai Zhong Fa. This was the strategy referenced in the C-drama How Dare You. This system took the salt voucher idea of the Song Dynasty to a new level. Instead of buying a voucher with cash, merchants had to pay with logistics. If a merchant delivered a certain amount of grain to a military outpost on the Great Wall, the government rewarded them with a corresponding salt certificate. And only merchants with these certificates were allowed to transport and sell salt to the public. Of course, at a massive markup. The Huizhou merchants were among the most disciplined and organized traders in the empire, and they quickly took over the salt trade networks. They built massive networks of wagons and warehouses, essentially becoming the outsourced logistics department for the Ming Dynasty military. But they didn't just move grain, they moved their entire social status. Because the salt depots were located in the south, these mountain-born merchants moved to the city of Yangzhou, turning it into one of the wealthiest and most extravagant cities in China. They used their salt money to build exquisite gardens and libraries. and buy the best education for their sons. While the Song dynasty merchants had started a trend of buying tutors for their sons, the Huizhou merchants turned it into a science. They realized that their salt wealth was only secure if they had family members inside the government protecting their interests. They wanted to bridge the two worlds, using merchant money to fund a scholar's lifestyle, and using a scholar's status to protect merchant profits. Maybe a father would run the salt trade, while his son would become a high-ranking minister in the capital. The boundary between scholar and merchant was dissolving. But the Huizhou merchants were still haunted by the ancient stigma that a merchant was fundamentally heartless and driven only by greed. For centuries, scholars emphasized the fundamental tension between righteousness and profit, arguing that a truly virtuous person couldn't pursue both. How could you chase profit while remaining a man of righteousness? To fight this, the Huizhou merchant became the greatest philanthropists in Chinese history. They argued that being an honest merchant, one who supports the family, the community, and the state, was itself a form of righteousness. They didn't just build gardens and libraries. They built bridges, funded orphanages, and established massive family ancestral halls to prove their Confucian values. They became the greatest patrons of the arts, known especially for their production of Huizhou ink and fine paper. They didn't just want to be rich, they wanted to be refined. They invented a new identity, the Confucian merchant, sometimes translated as the scholar merchant. The scholar Zhu Guozhen noted in his writings, the merchants of a region in their speech and behavior resembles the scholars. They follow strict principles in their dealings, putting righteousness before profit, and because of this, their business thrive. This phrase, righteousness before profit, became the ultimate branding for the Confucian merchant. They were arguing that being a good merchant didn't make you a bad Confucian. In fact, it was their Confucian integrity that made them better at business. This was a real revolutionary shift in Chinese moral philosophy. In 1644, the Ming dynasty made way for the Manchu-led Qing dynasty. For the Huizhou merchants, this was deeply disruptive. The Kaizhong system that had made them powerful had already been weakening in the late Ming dynasty and rapidly declined under the new Qing dynasty administration. And their political connections quickly lost much of their value. But the Huizhou merchants were adaptable. They regrouped, rebuilt their networks, and continued operating well into the Qing dynasty. The merchant class has survived dynastic collapses before, and it would again. This transition also saw the global economy enter a new phase. China had become the silver sink of the world. Spanish silver from the Americas was flooding into the empire, transforming the domestic market from one based on grain and salt into one fueled by hard global currency. And with all that silver circulating, the world needed something to spend it on. Suzhou had the answer. By the late Ming dynasty, Suzhou had become the silk capital of the world. Here, the ancient line between the artisan and the merchant was being erased entirely. The master weavers of Suzhou, as can be seen in the C-drama Marvelous Women, realized that the real power wasn't in the loom, it was in the ledger. They transitioned from skilled weavers into industrial managers, running their households like corporations and overseeing thousands of weaving looms. These were the Suzhou silk merchants. By the mid-Qing dynasty, these silk families weren't just artisans anymore. They were political power players who managed the government's imperial weaving department, providing the literal fabric of the emperor's court, while funneling massive profits into the private merchant economy. All of that silk needed a port, and that port was Guangzhou. In 1757, the Qing dynasty government established the Canton system, which decreed that all foreign trade must pass through a specific group of licensed merchants known as the 13 factories in the city of Guangzhou. This system handed these southern merchants a total monopoly on all ocean-going trades with the West, and made some of them the wealthiest men on earth. The legendary merchant Wu Bingjian, also known as Hao Guan, was commonly believed to be the richest man in the world. His personal fortune was once estimated to be larger than the entire United States national debt at the time. All of that silver still had one more problem to solve. For over 1,000 years, the merchants had been trying to solve the same problem: how to move wealth without moving heavy metal. The Tang Dynasty had used flying cash to represent copper coins. The Song Dynasty invented paper currency. The Ming Dynasty used salt certificates as payment. Each generation had iterated on the same fundamental challenge. But the Qing Dynasty economy ran on silver. Silver was the global currency of the age, but it was a logistical nightmare. It was heavier than copper, more valuable than paper, and a literal magnet for bandits. Moving a shipment of silver from the trading ports of the south to the capital in north required a private army of bodyguards and months of travel. A merchant's own wealth was his biggest obstacle to growth. The previous paper solution had another flaw. They all relied on the government. And as we saw in the Song Dynasty, if the government prints too much or panics, your paper becomes worthless. This is where the Shanxi merchants, or Jingshang, stepped in. They came from the rugged plateau province of Shanxi, a region of dry land and long trade routes that connected northern China with Mongolia and Central Asia. For generations, the people of Shanxi had survived by moving goods across vast distances, developing a reputation for discipline, trust, and financial skill. And unlike the Huizhou merchants, who had spent generations trying to look like scholars, the Shanxi merchants had a different attitude entirely. They were proud to be merchants, and that confidence showed in what they built. Rather than pouring their profits into gardens and academies, the Shanxi merchants focused on something far more practical. Around 1823, during the reign of the Emperor Daoguang, a Shanxi merchant named Lei Lutai had a brilliant idea. Instead of transporting physical silver across the empire, why not transport a paper draft instead? According to later anecdotes, Lei Lutai converted his shops across the empire into a draft bank that allowed for the exchange of silver across all provinces, built entirely on a reputation for honesty. This was the Piaohao, the first nationwide private banking system in China. What made the Piaohao revolutionary was that it was a private, family-run network based entirely on trust instead of government authority. A merchant could deposit 10,000 ounces of silver at a branch in Shanghai, receive a private bank draft, and his partner could withdraw that silver in Beijing the following week. No government permission required, no government receipts. Instead, they used secret codes, complex seals, and a strict code of honor. The Shanxi merchants lived by a single model: flow of wealth across the world, 汇通天下. At their peak, these merchant bankers controlled the financial bloodline of the Qing Dynasty empire. They didn't just lend money to other merchants, they lent money to the imperial government itself. This is the world depicted in the C-drama Legend of the Magnet, where the merchants and the scholars were locked in a marriage of convenience. The government needed the merchants' silver to fight wars and manage disasters. The merchants needed the government's protection to keep their banks legal and their roads safe. But the old hierarchy still exerted pressure in strange ways. Even though the Shanxi merchants were essentially shadow ministers of finance, they were still legally barred from the prestige of the scholar class. Their solution was blunt. Rather than waiting for their sons to pass the imperial exam, they simply bought official titles from the Qing Dynasty court. This practice was known as donating for rank. By the mid-19th century, it was common to see a merchant in the market wearing a purchased coral button of a second-grade official, a rank normally reserved for provincial governor. They were merchants by trade, but scholars by purchase. A saying from the Shanxi merchants captured their new confidence. A man should not be afraid of being a merchant. He should be afraid of not being a great merchant. But the world outside China was about to come crashing in. By the late 19th century, the Shunong Gongshang system was no longer a functioning hierarchy. It was a crumbling ruin. The Qing Dynasty Empire was being torn apart from the outside by foreign powers, and from the inside by rebellion and financial collapse. For the merchant, this was a period of profound tragedy, but also the moment they finally seized the lead role in the story of China. This turning point was the arrival of the foreign merchant. After the Opium Wars, the Qing Dynasty government was forced to open treaty ports, such as Shanghai, to foreign trade. The traditional Chinese merchant suddenly found themselves in a world where Confucian refinement meant nothing against steamships and industrial capital. Out of this collision was born a new and controversial class, the compradors. These were Chinese middlemen who worked directly for foreign firms, and some were even veterans of the 13 factories. They were the first to learn English, the first to understand Western accounting, and the first to truly grasp that the old social ladder was dead. But no one embodied the final evolution of the merchant more than Hu Xueyan. He started out as a lowly bank apprentice with nothing but his instincts. And through decades of calculated risk-taking and brilliant networking, he rose to become one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in Chinese history. He didn't just buy a title, he earned it through genuine service to the state. According to the draft history of Qing, Hu Xueyan donated funds to assist the military. His merits were recommended, and he was granted the rank of second grade and awarded the yellow riding jacket. He eventually earned the right to wear a red button on his hat, the highest official rank a merchant had ever achieved in the Qing Dynasty. This is what gave him his famous nickname, the Red-Topped Merchant. He was a merchant patriot. He used his vast fortune to fund the modernization of the Chinese military, buying Western guns and ships for the great general Zuo Zongtang to suppress rebellions and reclaim lost territory. He was the living proof that the scholars had become entirely dependent on the merchants for the survival of the nation. And then the system destroyed him anyway. Despite his rank and his decades of service, Hu Xueyan was still seen as an outsider by the traditional elite. When his business rivals and political enemies conspired against him, he was abandoned by the government that he had spent his life supporting. He died in poverty and disgrace. But the merchants who came after him read the situation clearly. The old game of earn enough money, buy enough rank, earn enough respect was over. The Shunong Gongshang ladder wasn't just broken, it was irrelevant. The future wasn't going to be built by scholar merchants. It was going to be built by industrialists. In the final years of the dynasty, families like the Rong family stopped chasing salt monopolies and silver drafts. They built flour mills, textile factories. They understood what the old Confucian elite refused to accept: that in the modernizing world, the artisans and the merchant weren't two separate rungs on the ladder. They were one and the same thing. When the Xinhai Revolution overthrew the Qing Dynasty in 1911, the Shunong Gongshang hierarchy was officially abolished. There is a modern saying, inspired by the economic ideas of the late Qing Dynasty scholar Liang Qichao, that says, "In the past, people looked down on the merchants. Today, they're the lifeblood of our nation." The story of the Shunong Gongshang system is a reminder that social labels are rarely permanent. Today, when we walk through the bustling streets of Shanghai or watch the high-stakes deals play out in a C-drama like Legend of the Magnet, we're seeing the legacy of those who were once at the very bottom of the ladder. And now, finally, they have become the foundation of the modern nation. But that old tension never really disappeared. For over 2,000 years, merchants were seen as a necessary problem. People who moved wealth, but also profited from imbalance. The empire distrusted them, regulated them, and looked down on them, yet depended on them to move grain, distribute salt, finance wars, and connect distant regions. In many ways, that perception still feels familiar today. We might not call them the lowest class anymore, but the image of the greedy businessman, the middleman taking a cut, or the corporation chasing profit at any cost hasn't exactly gone away. And in the end, the same ancient question remains. How could you chase profit while remaining a man of righteousness? What do you think about the evolution of the merchant? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's topic, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious, stay magical.